Every royal tomb in Egypt's Valley of the Kings had already been looted by the time modern archaeology arrived. After 15 years of funded digging with nothing to show for it, one excavator sent a water boy down a slope on his very last financed season. In November 1922, that boy's foot caught on something buried in the sand. Something no one alive had ever seen before was waiting just beneath it. The king nobody remembered, Tutankhamun, was born around 1341 BC, the son of Akhenaten, one of the most controversial pharaohs in Egyptian history. His birth name was Tutankhaten, meaning the living image of the Aten, reflecting the religion his father had spent his reign forcing on an entire civilization. Akhenaten had done something no Egyptian ruler had ever done. He declared that only one god existed, the sun disk called the Aten, and ordered the names of all other gods chiseled off every monument in the country. He closed temples, built a new capital city, and left Egypt weakened, its priesthood stripped of power, its people disoriented. When he died around 1336 BC, he left behind a country in crisis and a child heir of roughly 8 or 9 years old. That child became Tutankhamun. His advisors immediately reversed everything his father had built. Temples reopened, the old priests returned. The name Amun was cut back into the stone it had been chiseled from. The child changed his own name to match, renouncing the Aten entirely. Egypt returned to its ancient religion, and the memory of Akhenaten was systematically destroyed. Tutankhamun ruled for 9 years. A 2010 DNA and CT study published in JAMA found he had a clubfoot, a bone disorder in his foot, and evidence of multiple malaria infections. He is the only pharaoh shown seated in artworks depicting physical activities. He owned 130 walking canes, many worn with use. He died at approximately 18 or 19 years old. His successors erased his name from the official record alongside his father's. He disappeared from history with remarkable efficiency. He did not disappear from the valley and why every tomb in it was looted. The Valley of the Kings is a narrow, dry ravine cut into the limestone hills on the west bank of the Nile, directly across the river from the ancient city of Thebes, which is now the modern city of Luxor. The ancient Egyptians chose the west bank for burials because the sun set in the west, and death was associated with the western horizon. This specific valley, which the Egyptians called the Great Place, was used as the royal burial ground for roughly 500 years, from approximately 1550 to 1070 BC, during the period historians call the New Kingdom. The choice of a hidden valley rather than a visible monument was itself a response to a serious practical problem. For more than 1,000 years before the New Kingdom, Egyptian pharaohs had been buried in pyramids, the most visible structures anyone could build. The result was that every pyramid tomb was looted, most of them within a few generations of their construction. The treasure of the dead king, which Egyptian religious belief required to be enormous and elaborate to support the royal spirit in the afterlife, was also the treasure of everyone who could find a way inside. The New Kingdom pharaohs drew the obvious conclusion: a tomb you cannot find cannot be robbed. The solution was to cut the royal burial chamber directly into the rock of a remote valley, disguise the entrance as thoroughly as possible, fill the entrance corridor with rubble after the burial, and separate the public funerary temple, where priests performed the necessary rituals, from the burial site itself. The temple was visible. The tomb was supposed to be invisible. It did not work particularly well. Tomb robbing was endemic in ancient Egypt, and papyrus records from the late New Kingdom describe formal trials of men caught plundering royal burials. The organized robbery of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings was systematic enough that in the 21st dynasty, roughly 500 years after Tutankhamun, priests gathered the mummies of dozens of royal figures from their original tombs and hid them in a single concealed cache. Tutankhamun's mummy was among those moved, found in a mass royal cache at Deir el-Bahari in 1881. Tomb after tomb in the Valley of the Kings was found empty, or nearly empty, by the time modern archaeology reached Egypt. By the early years of the 20th century, professional opinion held that the valley had been completely excavated. Theodore Davis, an American lawyer and antiquities enthusiast who held the excavation concession for the valley from 1902 to 1914, found tomb after tomb and declared repeatedly that he believed the valley was exhausted. When his concession lapsed, largely because his own health was failing, he wrote that the valley had yielded all it had to offer. One man disagreed. The excavator who would not stop Howard Carter was born in Kensington, England in 1874, the youngest of 11 children. His father was an artist who taught him to draw. At 17, he went to Egypt as an archaeological draftsman for the Egypt Exploration Fund, and he spent the next decade learning the practice of field archaeology from experienced excavators, including the great Egyptologist Flinders Petrie. Carter became chief inspector of antiquities for Upper Egypt at the age of 25. His career hit a serious obstacle in 1905 when a confrontation between Egyptian site guards and a group of French tourists turned into a formal incident. Carter sided with the Egyptian guards and refused to apologize to the French, which the diplomatic situation essentially required. He resigned his inspectorate post and spent several difficult years doing commercial work and selling watercolors to tourists. In 1907, he was introduced to Lord Carnarvon, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a wealthy English aristocrat who had developed a serious interest in Egyptian antiquities, partly as a result of spending winters in Egypt for his health. Carnarvon hired Carter to supervise his excavations. In 1914, Carnarvon obtained the excavation concession for the Valley of the Kings that Davis had given up. World War I interrupted immediately, and Carter spent the war years working for the British government. He resumed digging in the valley in late 1917. Carter had studied every scrap of evidence about Tutankhamun that existed. Small objects bearing the boy king's name had turned up in various spots in the valley, suggesting a burial somewhere nearby. He had the excavation journals of Davis's team and knew that Davis had come within 2 meters of the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb before abandoning the area. Carter was methodical in a way that was unusual for the era. He divided the valley floor into sections and worked them systematically to bedrock, filling baskets with debris and moving on. Year after year, his Egyptian workforce shifted rubble and found nothing of significance. By 1922, Lord Carnarvon had had enough. He informed Carter that he would not continue funding the search. The costs were significant, the results were nothing, and he saw no reason to believe the next season would be different from the last several. Carter asked him for one more chance. He had identified a specific area of the valley floor that had not been fully excavated, a section covered by ancient workers' huts that previous excavators had left undisturbed. Carnarvon agreed to fund one final season. On November 1, 1922, Carter began clearing the area beneath those huts. On November 4th, a water carrier for the workers stumbled on a stone step cut into the bedrock. Carter ordered the workers to excavate. By the end of the next day, a full staircase of 12 steps had been exposed, leading down to a sealed doorway bearing the necropolis seal. If the kind of discovery that rewrites everything is what keeps you watching, subscribing is how you make sure the next one reaches you. Carter sent a telegram to Carnarvon. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations. Carnarvon arrived 3 weeks later, on November 23. Excavation resumed. By November 26, the corridor had been cleared, and Carter stood before the inner sealed doorway. He made a small hole in the upper left corner, held a candle to the gap, and looked through. Years later, he described the moment in his memoir. As his eyes adjusted to the light, details emerged from the darkness. Strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere the glint of gold. When Carnarvon asked if he could see anything, Carter replied with 4 words that became the most famous sentence in the history of archaeology. Yes, wonderful things. What was actually inside the tomb Tutankhamun was buried in was small by royal standards, probably because it had originally been prepared for someone else and was hastily converted for the boy king when he died unexpectedly young. A more elaborate tomb had been planned but never finished. The one he received has 4 rooms, an antechamber, an annex, the burial chamber, and a treasury. Together, they contained more than 5,000 objects, every one of them placed there by priests who believed they were equipping a king for eternity. The antechamber, the first room Carter's team could actually enter, was where the famous words were spoken. This room, roughly 26 feet wide and 11 feet deep, was packed floor to ceiling with objects. Gold-covered chariots had been disassembled to fit through the narrow entrance and then reassembled inside. There were gilded furniture, including a ceremonial couch with carved lion heads at its posts, alabaster containers of cosmetics and oils, model boats for the king's journey through the afterlife, alabaster vases, jewelry boxes, clothing. 2 large painted wooden statues of the king, life-sized, stood guard on either side of the door leading deeper into the tomb, their skin painted black to represent Osiris, gold kilts at their waists, holding the crook and flail of royal authority. The annex, accessed through a small opening in the antechamber wall, was filled with a different category of objects. weapons, including bows, arrows, and throwing sticks, jars of food and wine, board games, household objects. It looked less like a carefully arranged religious installation and more like someone had hurried to pack the room with everything a young man might need for a very long absence. The burial chamber itself was the smallest of the 4 rooms, but contained the most extraordinary objects. Almost the entire room was occupied by a series of gilded wooden shrines nested inside one another like Russian dolls, 4 of them in total, each one larger than the last. Inside the innermost shrine was a quartzite sarcophagus. Inside the sarcophagus were 3 coffins, also nested. The outer 2 were made of wood covered in gold. The innermost coffin was solid gold, 110 kilograms of it, 240 pounds, 1 inch thick. It was the most valuable single object ever found in an ancient Egyptian burial. Inside that gold coffin was the mummy of Tutankhamun. The face of the mummy was covered by the golden death mask, the object that has become the single most recognized artifact of ancient Egypt and one of the most famous objects in all of human history. It is made of 2 sheets of gold hammered together, weighing 10.23 kilograms. The eyes are obsidian and quartz. The eyebrows and eyelids are inlaid with lapis lazuli. A wide collar of semi-precious stones and colored glass spreads across the chest. On the forehead are the double emblems of kingship, the cobra of Lower Egypt and the vulture of Upper Egypt, representing the 2 lands unified under the pharaoh's rule. The mask depicts the king's face with a calm, formal expressiveness that has never been fully explained as either portrait or ideal. Carter described the mummified king himself, revealed when the mask was lifted, as a neatly wrapped mummy of the young king, with golden mask of sad but tranquil expression. The treasury, the 4th room, stored what Egyptian funerary practice considered the most sacred objects. The canopic chest held the embalmed organs of the king, his liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines, each placed in a separate compartment with a miniature golden coffin. 34 wooden statues of the king, in various forms, designed to serve him in the afterlife. A model boat, objects relating to the Osiris cult, more than 100 linen undergarments, a golden fan still holding the feathers put there at burial, a dagger with a blade made of iron derived from a meteorite, identified by analysis of its nickel content, an object of extraordinary value in an age before iron smelting was widespread. A trumpet, the oldest playable musical instrument ever found, which researchers actually sounded in 1939 and again in 1941. Food and wine. Carter spent 10 years cataloging everything. The process was meticulous. Every object was photographed in place, measured, described, and then carefully removed and transported to Cairo. The work, interrupted by legal disputes with the Egyptian government over access rights and by Carter's own occasional difficult personality, finally concluded in 1932. The objects are now held at the Grand Egyptian Museum in Giza, which opened its main galleries in recent years. Why the tomb survived everything. The survival of Tutankhamun's tomb intact for more than 3,000 years was not the result of superior security or especially careful concealment. It was an accident, working in combination with the political irrelevance of the person buried there. The tomb had in fact been entered twice in antiquity. Carter's team found evidence of both break-ins, holes dug through the sealed doorways, and then filled in again, meaning that someone had entered, taken what they could carry quickly, and then left, after which officials had repaired the entrance and resealed it. What those ancient robbers took appears to have been primarily small, portable items, perfumes, oils, cosmetics. The larger and heavier objects were left because carrying them through the narrow entrance passages would have been extremely difficult. After the second break-in and resealing, the tomb was buried. Approximately 2 centuries after Tutankhamun's death, workers constructing the nearby tomb of Ramesses VI dumped their excavation debris directly over the entrance to KV-62, the designation archaeologists use for Tutankhamun's tomb. Workers' huts were built over the same area. The entrance to the tomb disappeared beneath several feet of limestone chips, and then beneath the floors of the huts. Within a generation, no one remembered it was there. From that point, the tomb sat undisturbed. Every other major royal tomb in the valley was systematically looted over the following centuries. Tutankhamun survived because no one could find it. And because no one could find it, no one particularly looked. His name had been removed from the records. He was a minor pharaoh in the eyes of posterity, remembered if at all, only as the successor of the hated heretic Akhenaten. The absence of his name from the official lists meant no one thought to search for his tomb specifically. He was forgotten so completely that his forgetting became his protection. That protection lasted from roughly the 12th century BC to November 4th, 1922, when a water carrier hit a stone step with his foot and set in motion the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. What the discovery revealed about ancient Egypt. The significance of the tomb of Tutankhamun extends far beyond the objects themselves, remarkable as those objects are. What it revealed was something that had never before been possible to know with any confidence: what a complete royal Egyptian burial actually looked like. Every other pharaonic tomb in the Valley of the Kings had been robbed. The objects that remained in those tombs when modern archaeologists found them were the things robbers had left behind. The empty sarcophagi, the bare walls, the scattered debris of what had once been an elaborate installation. Historians could describe ancient Egyptian funerary practice from tomb reliefs, from papyrus texts, from the sparse evidence that robbery left behind, but they had never seen a royal burial as it was designed to be. Tutankhamun's tomb changed that. It showed exactly how the objects were arranged, what categories of thing were placed in each room, how the shrines nested, how the coffins were organized, what quantities of food and clothing and personal objects were considered necessary for a king's afterlife. It demonstrated, in physical terms that no text had fully conveyed, the scale of belief that ancient Egyptians invested in the continuation of royal existence after death. It also demonstrated, in the contrast between the opulence of the burial and the physical reality of the body, something more poignant. The king whose face is covered by a mask of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship, who is surrounded by evidence of wealth and power exceeding anything most of his contemporaries could have imagined, was a teenager who had trouble walking unassisted. The 130 canes buried with him, many of them well worn, spoke more directly to his actual life than any of the golden objects that surrounded them. Carter himself, writing about the moment when the gold mask was lifted and the mummy beneath it was revealed, allowed himself a brief departure from his usual methodical prose. He wrote that the face of the young king, until now known only by name amid that sepulchral silence, made him realize the past. Not in the way that historical study realizes the past, through documents and inference, in the way that a face realizes it. The curse that was and was not. No account of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb is complete without addressing what the press called the curse of the pharaohs. It became one of the great stories of the 1920s, and like many great stories, it requires some careful handling. Lord Carnarvon died on April 5, 1923, less than 5 months after the tomb was officially opened. He had been bitten by a mosquito on his cheek. The bite became infected. Infection led to pneumonia, and he died in a Cairo hotel room at the age of 57. The story that swept across the world's newspapers was that a curse inscribed on the tomb had killed him. Some accounts added detail that all the lights in Cairo went out at the moment of his death, that his dog in England howled and died simultaneously. The popular press was vivid and enthusiastic. The factual basis for the curse was thin. No inscription threatening death to those who entered the tomb was found anywhere in KV 62. Howard Carter, who had the most exposure to the tomb of anyone involved, lived until 1939, another 16 years. The Egyptologist Arthur Mace, who entered the tomb with Carter on the first official opening, died in 1928, which added to the legend, but which was also, as Carter noted, likely related to his prior health problems. A systematic study published in the British Medical Journal in 2002 found no statistically significant difference in the lifespans of people who entered the tomb and those who did not. What there was, and what is genuinely interesting, is a brief inscription found in the tomb that reads, "It is I who hinder the sand from choking the secret chamber. I am for the protection of the deceased." This is a standard protective formula, not a curse directed at intruders, but in the atmosphere of 1922, with newspapers hungry for supernatural drama, the distance between protection and curse was easily collapsed. The curse of the pharaohs has never gone away. It continues to appear in popular culture in a form that Carter himself, a methodical man who spent 10 years carefully cataloging objects in a room, would have found wearisome. What the mummy revealed that shocked researchers: the objects in the tomb were extraordinary, but the most scientifically significant discovery in the entire excavation of KV 62 was the body itself. Tutankhamun's mummy is the only royal Egyptian mummy ever found entirely in its original burial context, undisturbed in its own coffin. Every other royal mummy that has been studied, including those moved to the mass cache at Deir el-Bahari, had been removed from its original burial and rewrapped by priests who were protecting it from further disturbance. Tutankhamun's body was where the priests had left it in 1323 BC, wearing the objects placed on it at the time of burial, in the coffin sealed at the funeral. When Carter's team removed the mummy from the coffin in 1925, the work was more difficult than expected. The anointing oils used in the burial ritual had congealed and solidified over 3,000 years, essentially cementing the mummy to the interior of the gold coffin. Carter was faced with a difficult practical problem and made a decision that later generations of Egyptologists have criticized. He allowed the mummy to be somewhat disarticulated during removal. The head was separated from the body. Limbs were detached. The approach was driven by the physical necessity of separating the mummy from the coffin, but it meant the body was in a more damaged state by the time it was examined than it would have been if left in place. What subsequent analysis revealed upended the popular image of the boy king entirely. The 2010 JAMA study, which used CT scanning and DNA analysis on Tutankhamun and 11 other royal mummies from his family, was the first genetic study ever conducted on ancient Egyptian royal remains. It established that his father was almost certainly Akhenaten, and that his mother, identified from a mummy in a tomb designated KV35, was a daughter of Amenhotep III, meaning Tutankhamun was the product of a sibling marriage. The 18th dynasty had practiced close relative marriage for generations, and the study found evidence of resulting genetic conditions in multiple family members. In Tutankhamun himself, the analysis found a clubfoot, bone necrosis, affecting the foot consistent with Kolar disease 2, a cleft palate, and indications of malaria infection from Plasmodium falciparum. The study proposed that a fall causing a serious leg fracture combined with an existing malaria infection most likely caused his death. Zahi Hawass, who led the Egyptian side of the study, noted that the king had been frail and that his own advisors had probably held most real power throughout his reign. The image that emerged from the science was of a young man who spent his brief life in physical pain, propped up politically by more experienced advisors, trying to undo the damage his father had caused, and dying before he could accomplish very much of it. The golden mask that covers his face, the elaborate burial equipment that surrounds him, the 130 canes that documented his daily difficulty, and the malaria in his tissue all belong to the same person. What they reveal together is stranger and more human than any of them reveals alone. Verdict here is where things actually stand. Tutankhamun, born around 1341 BC as the son of the pharaoh Akhenaten, came to the throne at approximately 8 or 9 years old, after his father's religious revolution had thrown Egypt into crisis. He reigned for roughly 9 years, reversed his father's monotheistic reforms, restored the traditional Egyptian gods, and died at approximately 18 or 19 years old in 1323 BC. A 2010 study published in JAMA using CT scanning and DNA analysis found he suffered from a clubfoot, Kolar disease 2, a cleft palate, and malaria, and proposed that a leg fracture combined with malaria most likely caused his death. He was buried in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings that had likely been prepared for someone else. His successors systematically erased his name from official records. Workers building the nearby tomb of Ramesses VI buried his entrance under debris approximately 2 centuries after his death. It stayed buried for over 3,000 years. On November 4, 1922, a water carrier working for British archaeologist Howard Carter's excavation team stumbled on a stone step cut into bedrock in the Valley of the Kings near Luxor. Clearing revealed a corridor leading to a sealed doorway. Carter wired Lord Carnarvon, who arrived on November 23rd. On November 26th, Carter made a small hole in the inner doorway, held a candle to the gap, and described seeing strange animals, statues, and gold, everywhere the glint of gold. The tomb contained 4 rooms and more than 5,000 objects, including a solid gold innermost coffin weighing 110 kilograms, a golden death mask weighing 10.23 kilograms, with obsidian and quartz eyes and lapis lazuli inlay, a meteorite iron dagger, disassembled gold-covered chariots, 130 walking canes, many showing signs of actual use, and the intact mummy of a teenage king who had been forgotten so completely that his forgetting had protected him. Carter spent 10 years cataloging everything. The objects are now at the Grand Egyptian Museum in Giza. Tutankhamun's mummy remains in the Valley of the Kings, in the tomb where it has rested since 1323 BC. His name is now spoken by millions of people every year. The ancient Egyptians believed that the dead live as long as their names are spoken. By that measure, the boy whose successors tried to erase him entirely has achieved an immortality far beyond anything that was intended. If this is the kind of story you keep coming back to, subscribing means you hear the next one when it comes out.